Welcome, everyone, to the Leading Together podcast. This is First State Educates podcast that's focused on empowering school boards and building capacity in communities around the state. I'm Julia Kelleher. I'm the executive director of First State Educate, and we're pleased to welcome you all with us here today. I have the distinct pleasure of being accompanied by Jim Taylor. So, Jim is a trial lawyer who has had extensive experience with complex litigation. He's a partner at Saul Ewing. And a significant portion of his practice uses litigation and experience to counsel clients in managing high profile cases, but also sort of getting in front of the risks, the reputational risks, and creating policies and procedures. So in our view, we think this is extremely valuable, right? Because what boards want to do is kind of avoid a problem. So the fact that he's sitting down with us and willing to share his expertise is deeply appreciated. He was the co-chair of the higher education group, the practice at Saul Ewing. And then he also has expertise with K-12 schools, K-12 charter schools, and representing public bodies with respect to FOIA. So, Jim, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning.
Pleasure
Thanks
to
for
have
having
you
me.
here.
Thank
Sure.
you.
So, just to give the audience a little bit of perspective, I shared your expertise as a legal professional, right? As a lawyer, but you also have expertise and experience as a school board member. Could you share a little bit of that with our audience?
I do. Yes. Thank you. So long ago, I think very late 90s, around the turn of the century, I served on the Red Clay School Board as an elected school board member. Was actually elected before I had a child. And my daughter was born very early in my tenure. So education has been a passion of mine, educational policy, and my wife founded a charter school in Delaware. And so I like to say that I've seen public schools and I've seen charter schools from almost every side.
Mm-hmm. And so, why is public education an important topic for the public to care about?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that it touches every life in some way, right? All of us went to
Mm-hmm.
school. All of us are products of the education and upbringing that we've had. And in Delaware, whether you go to a public school or a private school, you undoubtedly have run into those who graduate from public schools, become our leaders, become our civic and community activists. And I just think it's something that we all benefit from.
Yeah, I interviewed Rod Ward a week or so ago,
Mhm.
and he was sharing that the majority of the employees at CSC are Delaware graduates,
Yeah,
and CSC is a global company, right? It's an
right.
incredible powerhouse of an entity, and the fact that like public schools are really producing the workforce that is helping Delaware, you know, do great things just at home and also internationally, but in an area where like every business registers in Delaware, right? Because it's got most of the Fortune 500 companies are here. So I just thought that it is really needed, and I would agree with you. It does touch pretty much every aspect of public life. So today we're going to talk about ethical decision making. That's an area I think as a lawyer you have great perspective, and then also during your time drawing on your experience as a board member. Could we frame for the audience first, like when we say boards need to make ethical decisions, what are we talking about?
Sure. Yeah. So let me start by saying I don't pretend that I have a corner on what is and is not ethical. I would never ever deign to say so. But when I think about it, I really think that it comes down to being able to make a decision that is in the public interest, in the interest of the body on which you're serving, not your own interest.
Mhm.
And to me, that's what it really comes down to. Being able to is that when I talk to boards, when I present to them, when I answer questions for them about conflicts of interest or whatever it may be, I really try to distill it down to what hat are you wearing at a particular time? Can you take off your individual hat and not think about your own interests, but think about the broader interests and the greater good? And people can disagree within that. As I say, I certainly
Mhm.
don't corner on what's the right thing, but where I've seen boards, where I've seen members get into trouble, it's when they haven't been able to separate their own individual interests from the greater interests.
Mhm. Mhm. And is that something that one learns over time through experience, or are there maybe some guiding principles to keep in mind that help? with that determination?
I think with most things, it's a mixed answer. I think certainly experience helps. Having seen something before always helps. Having lived with it before certainly helps. But in terms of sort of how to approach it, I always like to think in terms of the hat example, right? Of if I'm a board member, when I was on the Red Clay board, for example. Although as I mentioned, I did not have a child in a public school when I was elected, maybe even when I was serving. Uh,
Hmm.
but I had other members on the board and who did and who were very passionate about their naturally their children, very passionate about the schools that their children attended. But I started to see and understand there that where that could create some issues is if those individual board members were blinded by what was in the best interest of their child or best interest of their child's school, as opposed to in the Red Clay example, I think we had 27 schools. So being able to think about the broader district, taking off the parent hat, taking off the, I'm a supporter of X school hat, and really being able to think about what's best for the broader school district. And look, to be clear, that's easier said than done.
Sure.
um, we all are human. We all have our own biases and our own strengths and weaknesses that we bring to the table. To me, it's recognizing it. What they teach you in law school is spotting issues. You talk to any lawyer, they'll talk about issue spotting.
Hmm.
And to me, that's what it is when you're serving on a public body, when you're serving on a board. It's being able to spot the issue and recognize, aha, this might be a place. This might be a time where my
Hmm.
individual interests and the greater interests are diverging. I have to be conscious of that. I have to know it, and I have to think about how I want to address it.
Hmm. I don't know if you remember, but did the board did the Red Clay board kind of go through any sort of training in this regard? Was there any kind of structured approach to orienting board members around this?
You're right. It was back when the dinosaurs were walking back
Right.
when they were serving. But the short answer is I'm confident there was not training
Uh-huh.
because I was a new board member and I learned by watching the more seasoned board members. And so I know there was not training. And I know even today it's a challenge for boards
Hmm.
to have training and to have meaningful real training that focuses on this kind of issue about spotting conflicts of interest, your point about ethical decision making, sort of what should I be thinking about? What kind of rubric should I have in my head about how to approach this issue and this
Hmm. Hmm.
dynamic?
Yeah, I think that that's probably going to be an area in 2025 where we'll lean in a little bit and try to provide some materials and resources that we can disseminate, right? I mean, I think one thing is sort of paying for a formal professional development, but the other thing that First Aid Educate can do is really just provide access to information and resources. And it's correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems almost like something that a person could develop this issue spotting ability as a result of reading, reading some case studies or reading, a tip sheet or here's some strategies, right? That, there's a lot of different ways to learn.
There certainly are different ways to learn. Although I will say that I think one of the best ways to learn it is by thinking about a real life scenario and
Hmm.
how an individual would address that. And one thing that I believe very strongly in, having worked with public bodies up and down the state, is that it's always easier to work through the issue and think about how you would address it in the what I call the quiet moments, right?
Hmm.
If you're doing it as part of board governance, as one esteemed lawyer who I really credit said one time, sort of governance hygiene, corporate hygiene, board hygiene. If you're doing it as part of that in
Hmm.
training in the quiet moments when you're not dealing with a difficult, challenging, controversial
Hmm.
public issue, you're going to
Hmm.
learn a lot more.
Hmm.
It is really hard and maybe almost impossible to expect a board and a board member to wrestle with how to deal with that when they're thinking about it for the first time, when it's a difficult, challenging, controversial public issue.
Yeah, that's a great point. I want to come back to doing, managing a controversial issue that is high profile, that has a lot of public interest on it. Um, but I'm also curious about um, in terms of the this board hygiene or these quiet moments, right? That happens when the board's not doing the thing that the board is seen doing, which is sitting during the meeting, right? So how important is it for board members to have relationships and to have trust to be able to kind of explore fully any one topic so that these kinds of ethical considerations could be, aired and explored.
Well, it's critical, and we're, your audience is largely thinking about and talking about public schools and public bodies in Delaware, and so they're all subject to FOIA, where those relationships are key, but the conversations are to happen in public, at a public meeting. And one thing that I think that sort of training, that sort of decision making process can really bring to bear is it can encourage that kind of productive dialogue at
Hmm.
the board meeting, which is where it's supposed to happen.
Hmm.
And where boards have run astray of FOIA, it's because they frankly haven't had that kind of robust exchange of ideas and thoughts at the table.
Hmm.
And instead, where there have been, FOIA violations because they've done it in executive session when they shouldn't, or they've just very clearly reached a decision outside of public view and then come in and, doesn't it doesn't take a lawyer to figure out that if you
Sure.
show up at a public meeting and everybody votes on a controversial issue and there's very little discussion about it, that there probably
Right.
was discussion somewhere else.
Right, right. I think it is important too. This notion of discussion and what does the public expect to see and experience and hear at a board meeting? Is it reading agenda items, and is it, here's a presentation for a school and here's some data, or is it really a public discussion and exploration of an issue for the benefit of everyone who's impacted by the decision?
Yeah, I mean, and again, I certainly don't have a corner on good governance, or to your point about ethical decision making, but I think most people would say in a perfect world, it would be a robust discussion at the table and an
Hmm.
exchange of
Hmm.
ideas. That's why you're dealing with an elected board in many cases. You're dealing with board members who are there because they are supportive of particular issues and they have a particular passion, and that's all good. The
Hmm.
question
Hmm.
is, how do those ideas get exchanged and how can
Yeah.
there be a productive dialogue? And then it goes back to my point about being able to understand, okay, I recognize my passion is X. Um, can I sometimes be willing to see the other side on these issues
Sure.
and think about what's in the best interest in this case, of the school, of the district?
Yep. 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 Um, Interesting. Okay, so let's flip to sort of our second segment. What are the implications of ethical decision making when the board makes a decision, right? And let's say that decision comes into question, or someone has concern whether or not there was a conflict of interest, or it was made, with the right framing, and the public good was put first. What are the consequences, right, for public trust in institutions and things like that when the decision making falls into question?
Yeah, well, you just hit it. Public trust, I think, is the top. I mean, when I talk to boards, I talk, of course, because I'm there usually in a capacity as a lawyer, so they're asking me about legal issues. But I frequently say, listen, I'm going to talk about the legal issues and I'm going to talk about the legal repercussions. But let me step aside from that first and talk about the other bad things that can come from this that are not purely legal. And again, not in my, I
Sure.
don't have a corner on them, as I always always repeatedly say. But it's the trust angle, it's the PR angle.
Mhm.
Um, those things, frankly, can often matter more than whatever the legal repercussion might be,
Mhm.
because you may be able to fix, reverse, change whatever the legal repercussion is
Mhm.
in any walk of life. Once you lose trust, right? Once you lose that and have that damaging PR, it's very hard to get it back if you can at all.
Yeah.
Um, and that's not just the public, but it's also between members.
Mhm.
And one of the things that we run into and I see a lot, are confidential matters that are supposed to be kept confidential and permissible, for example, executive session topics, and yet board members have a difficult time doing so. And
Mhm.
we've all seen situations where something was discussed in executive session, something that was supposed to be kept confidential, and it didn't remain confidential.
Mm.
Um, that is a really quick way to burn trust within your community, starting with your board, your administration, and then your broader community writ large. And
Mhm.
again, it's really hard to get that back. And
Right.
that goes to the point of, I'm not here to judge a particular board member who chooses to do that. Maybe there was a reason why that board member thought that was the right thing, but you have to know what hat you're wearing. And even if that board member in my hypothetical thinks that that's the right thing to do for him or her,
Mhm.
it can't be the right thing for the broader school community. And that's where it falls apart.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's a great illustration. Just to divert just a second, maybe I'm not sure if all of our listeners are familiar with what executive session is.
Sure,
So there's
sure.
the public meeting. Could we just talk a little bit about what executive session is, its function, and what kinds of things are talked about there?
Sure. So if you have a public body that's subject to FOIA and its meetings are supposed to be, must be open and discussion
Mhm.
held in open public session and votes held in open public session, there are limited times under the Freedom of Information statute when discussions can be held in executive session. Typically, that's personnel matters. If you're talking about a school, a student disciplinary matter, certain legal matters, it's pretty narrow. Um,
Mhm.
but there are times where, for example, a personnel matter or a student disciplinary matter is being discussed appropriately in executive session. And
Mhm.
again, we've seen situations where a board member doesn't like the direction of a conversation or disagrees with an ultimate decision or whatever it
Mhm.
is, and that confidential discussion or portions of it get get distributed publicly.
Mhm.
And that's, as I say, a really quick way to burn trust. And in my mind, a great example of often a board member who's perhaps thinking about his or her own individual interests as
Mhm.
opposed to the greater interests.
Yeah, it is common, and it's an important point. I'm glad that you're bringing it up. That individuals have their own preferred issues, and that's not a problem. People care about different
Correct.
things, or they have positions on policy, even though boards are supposed to be nonpartisan. That I think all of that is it's okay to come to the table as your whole self. No one's asking you to leave part of yourself behind, right?
In fact,
But
sorry
I
to cut you off, but that's why they're there, right? They're there because they
right.
have a passion, and you want that. You don't want people who are disinterested. So, indeed, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. Sorry.
Exactly. No, no, no. I think it's a great point. Many people run because they care about a certain thing, and then it's sort of this question of how do you frame your child's experience in the larger context, and when that issue is resolved, what's your approach to looking at every other issue that maybe wasn't the motivating force for why you joined the board, and how do you, and this may be in my opinion, you correct me if I'm wrong, it's also a component of the ethical decision making in the sense that I have to show up equally for every issue. I can't show up partially pay attention because I care about this topic and just let things go because I don't really care about this other topic.
I think it's a really great way to put it. I mean, you know, apologies for the legal jargon for a second. Every board member has a fiduciary duty, and part of exercising that fiduciary duty is exactly what you said. And I love the way you put it. Right, showing up equally for every issue. Um,
Mhm,
and this goes to my issue spotting idea, right? Recognizing that, hey, I feel really passionate about this issue. I'm actually almost disinterested in this issue over here. I
mhm,
recognize that. That may mean I have to spend more time thinking about it. That may mean I need to ask more questions over here, even though I'm
mhm,
really passionate about this and I know I'm going to ask a lot of questions and express a lot of voices. I actually need to pay attention and make sure I'm doing the same thing over here because that's when I'm exercising my fiduciary duty. And that goes to your point. I mean, ethical decision making to me captures a lot of things, right? we
mhm,
can all we can all talk about and spot the issue of, okay, well, obviously ethical decision making starts with you can't steal money, right? You can't do something that lines your pocket. You can't do something that benefits you and not others,
mhm,
right? Those are sort of the easy ones to state. um, Conflicts of interest, there are conflicts of interest, right? Particularly in Delaware, recognizing when there is one, recognizing when you are not able to objectively decide an issue. Those are things that training,
mhm,
those are things that board governance can really help work through. But it's
mhm,
this last piece that I think is frequently the biggest rub, which is how do you
mhm,
get someone to, and I love again your phrase, show up
mhm.
equally for all issues. I think that's a
Yeah.
great way to put it and a great way to think about it as a board member.
Mhm. It's a challenge too, right? Because this is a non-paid position. And
Right.
there's a lot of work
Right.
associated with it.
Well, there's a lot of work associated with it, and look, there's a lot of trust that has to come with it, which is why the is so important. When I was on the Red Clay board, as I say, I think we had 27 schools.
Mhm.
Our CFO would show up for the budget meetings with a binder that was right, and I mean, looking back on it, I wish that I frankly had asked more questions.
Mhm.
I trusted the administration, I trusted the CFO, and I followed the guidance of more senior, longer serving members on the board and kind of how they approached it. Um, but I wish I had known to follow my own advice back then and frankly
Right.
ask more questions.
Yeah.
I knew I didn't know much. I
Mhm.
knew I didn't know much about the finances, and I let that kind of dictate it. And if you go back to what I'm saying now, and a lesson I would like to teach myself as when I was serving, which is just ask the question. Because if I have
Right.
the question, somebody else in the room probably does. And if
Right.
not, it doesn't matter because at least then I'm exercising my diligence and making sure that my question is being asked and the public can see that kind of engagement.
Sure.
There's,
Yeah.
it must be disconcerting for the public to watch a presentation on the budget like that and see stone-faced board members who just say, "Okay, sure," right? That's not what it's
Sure.
for.
Sure.
But it is, like you said, it's very dense, and particularly in a district like that where there's so much information coming at you,
Mhm.
it can be hard
Mhm.
to know sort of where to focus.
Sure.
Um, but that's where having those conversations and encouraging that kind of dialogue, and to board leaders really encouraging and prompting the board members to ask those questions and making
Right.
it, encouraging them and letting them know that it's going to be welcomed,
Yeah.
not a distraction.
So I'll share something with you, as I love that you just made this point about the questions. It's really fascinating. This podcast allows us to bring a lot of different perspectives
Yep.
to the table, right? And that's the point. We're looking for the best minds and strong leadership across the state to share perspective from wherever they're seated on the role of school boards. And something that keeps coming back up is the importance of asking a question and normalizing the reality that we can't know everything about everything, and that when we're in a decision making chair, it's kind of our job to ask questions, yet people don't feel comfortable doing it because there's this we're sort of socialized to say, like, oh, you must not know what's going on, you're not smart enough, and that's why you had to ask a question. And I think that's detrimental.
It is detrimental, and no doubt about it. And you can also, if you have a board that has, whether it's 5 members or 7 members, and all of them have, to our earlier conversation, a particular passion, a particular expertise. I know when I served on the Red Clay board, there was someone who was a finance person by trade who
Hmm.
really dug into the budget. And so I know I was intimidated, right? Like, I'm
Hmm.
not sure I want to ask a question because I know my question is likely to be dumb, and this person over there is going to know
Sure.
the answer. And so, for board leaders to recognize that there's
Sure.
going to be a disparity on knowledge about a particular issue, and to really
Hmm.
encourage that conversation and those questions. And that's
Yeah.
something that I think is more easily discussed in the quiet moments, right? When there's a
Hmm.
board workshop or retreat to talk about how do we want to operate as a board, or board training, to
Hmm.
set the tone from the top, right? To set the tone from the board leadership to say, not only is it encouraged, it's expected. And
Right.
we're not going to literally or proverbially roll our eyes at someone like Jim who asks a silly question, because let's all learn from it, and
Right.
let's encourage it, because that's so much better than the stone faces. And
Yes.
sure, we'll bless this budget that's yay big with almost
Right.
no questions.
Yeah, and there are hundreds of millions of dollars.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And
So not everybody gets a chance to make decisions with that many zeros, right? And it's an enormous responsibility.
It is, and this goes back to how you framed it about showing up equally for each issue,
Hmm.
and to the point, as I say, ethical decision making to me covers a lot of territory. There's the decisions we would all look at and say that can't possibly happen. That's unethical, and we all
Sure.
know it. But on the other end of that spectrum, it's this, right? Like, you know. Even if it might not neatly fit the definition of unethical, it certainly fits the definition of not exercising your board responsibilities fully and faithfully. If you have a question and you don't ask it, or if you don't understand something, because
Hmm.
it is a responsibility. The public has placed you there for that reason,
Right.
and your fiduciary duty obligates you to make sure that you were duly informed. And
Hmm.
again, if I could go back and talk to Jim, the school board member, many, many moons ago, I would be
Yeah.
having exactly that same conversation to say,
Yeah.
you really should. You should ask more questions.
Yeah. Well, in a way, you're doing the entire Delaware community a great service by sharing what you would have said, because everyone who's seated now, and as you know, elections will be in May of
Right.
2025, so people are
Right.
deciding right now, should I raise my hand and run? And I think hearing, even if it's what you would have told yourself back then, is really, really helpful for a person who's maybe in their first year or thinking about running, knowing that, it's okay to think these things and to get this kind of help when you first join the board.
Yeah, it is, and I appreciate you saying that. That's very kind, and and taking it, into the charter school space where we have a particular experience and expertise. Those are kind of often have the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of dealing with the board members who show up with particular interests, because it's one school typically, right? It's one school, and so on when I was
Right.
on the red clay board, it was a good day if I could remember every 27 schools, let alone who
Mhm.
was the leader of the 27 schools. And so if
Sure.
a personnel matter or a disciplinary matter came to us, there was no chance I was going to know the teacher or the student, whatever the case may be.
Right.
Very, very different in a small public body setting.
Sure.
And all the more important for that board member to be able to say, can I really exercise independent judgment here? Can I take off
Mhm.
the hat that is the parent, or just the community member, just somebody who happens to know this school? Because not only will those board members know the head of school, of course, they'll know most of the teachers, right? And if they have
Mhm.
children in the school, they'll know many of the families.
Yeah.
So it's just really important to be able to spot it and to understand, in conflict of
Mhm.
interest territory, you know, there are clear conflicts of interest that exist, but there are the others where it may not be so clear, but a board member nevertheless understands that he or she cannot operate independently and objectively. And then
Mhm.
it's incumbent upon that board member to say, even if legally I could do it, objectively I cannot, and
Right.
so I should not be operating here, and I should not be making a decision on this point.
Mhm. Mhm. It's really great that you gave this almost like a concrete example, because in the time we have remaining, I was going to ask if you wanted to share an example, like we could walk through a scenario, whether it's in real life or one that happened with you, one that happened when you were on the board that you observed, or something in your range
Well,
of
well,
professional
well,
experience.
sure. I mean, so let me just give a really simple example, right? There's a student disciplinary matter, and a discussion is held in an executive session, and then there's a vote in public that is, not descriptive, because that's, it doesn't say this is what we're going to do for Johnny's situation, but it's a vote that says we're going to take the action as discussed in executive session. Well, two things. Um, let's assume that there's some publicity around this within the school community, right? Individuals know what the incident was and they're curious about what's going to happen with this student. The board member has to be comfortable and has to understand that confidentiality requires that it be kept confidential and that the discussion
Mhm.
in executive session not be shared. Number one. Number two, if that board member is going to leave the board meeting and go talk to parents who are friends, right? Friends who want to
Mhm.
know, that's a great example of knowing what hat you're wearing.
Mhm.
It takes a lot of courage to be able to say to your close friends, to people who are, hey, I just want to know what happened. What are we going to do about that situation? To say, I can't tell you.
Right.
And again, this is just something that it's easy to say. It is really hard to practice. But it takes a board member to be able to say, I'm not going to be able to disclose this to you. And I've actually said to board members in the past in trainings and when situations have come up, if you can't give the answer, if you can't say, I'm sorry, I can't share this, then you may not be able to participate
in the room, right?
And in fact, you should really be questioning whether you can actually serve as a board member, because that situation may occur time and again. Hopefully not, but you never know. And you have to be able and comfortable and confident to be able to say to your friends who are pestering you, what happened? What happened?
Right.
I can't tell you. Not a wink and a nod, not a like, well, let me tell you this, but don't tell anybody else.
Right.
I can't tell you. And that is really hard to practice.
It's fascinating because it goes back to the point we made as one of the first things said in the podcast, was that, public education is important because it touches everyone in the state in some way. No one really sort of lives here and doesn't have some interaction. And what you're talking about that I really, really appreciate, and I think is part of one of the values that First Aid Educate moves to advance, is that it's a collective responsibility. Improving public education and ensuring kids get a high quality public education isn't a teacher's responsibility. It's not just the parents' responsibility. It's not the district superintendent. It's not the board, right? It's not the Department of Education. It's not Dover. It's all of us. And just as much as that board member should not disclose, if I were the friend in your example, maybe my responsibility is to not ask.
Fair. I assume there are limits to what we can control, but you're right. Ideally, that's the case. And this goes back to sort of the point about dealing with it in the quieter moments, right? In my friend example, that board member could say to the friend group, like, you're gonna want to know things,
right?
And there are gonna be things I can't tell you. In the charter school world, by law, there has to be, under the statute, there has to be a parent of children in the school on the board, and there has to be a teacher employed by the school on the board by law. And so you run into this all the time talking to parent members, teacher members. They have to be conscious of what hat they're wearing, and in that example, willing to go into the teacher's lounge the next day and say, there are certain things I can't share. I can't do it. I know you all want to know the answer, but I can't, because I have this obligation here. And again, that's really easy on a Monday morning to say, sitting in my office. It's a whole heck of a lot harder to do in the teacher's lounge when they're all looking at you saying, so what's it going to be?
Right.
That's a very, very difficult, challenging thing. And the only way through it is to understand the obligations, to understand the limits, to understand what hat you're wearing, and hopefully to have those conversations ahead of time with board leaders, but also in my teacher example, to say to the teachers, you're going to want to know the answer, and I can't tell you. I have obligation. I have a fiduciary duty. I have, to use your word, I have an ethical obligation where I cannot share that under these certain circumstances. There'll be a time where we can. But right now it's confidential, and I can't talk about what you want to know about this personnel matter hypothetically.
You said like such a pro. I wonder if you've had to do that often in your professional practice.
Perhaps once or twice or a few times.
It's been fabulous to spend time with you. I always enjoy our conversations. You, like I said in the beginning, you have a wealth of knowledge and experience. We are so grateful that you shared that with us and are supporting First Aid Educate in our efforts to democratize sort of access to this information so that boards are better prepared, that the public understands what it means to serve on a board. The great points you raised, from issue spotting to asking questions to talking about these three levels of what the concerns are, sort of basically, it's wrong. You have to figure out if there's a conflict of interest, and then, actually knowing what is something that's invisible, like should you or shouldn't do it. Are you showing up with this notion of your whole self? So there's a much more we could talk about with FOIA, but I do appreciate the explanation of executive session that you also gave us. I think that this was very, very helpful. But you have just tremendous experience, and it's always a pleasure. And I learned so much, as I always do. So thank you for being with us today.
Well, you're very kind. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Thank you to everyone for watching and look forward to our next episode.